All right, so let's talk through here what exactly convection is and how that convection inside the Earth impacts the movement of the crust or the lithosphere on the outside of the Earth. So you should be looking at your part 2 convection and seeing this diagram. We're going to fill in a few blanks, label this picture, and then work together to fill out this table describing what's happening with convection for both convergent boundaries and divergent boundaries. So as we think about this idea of convection, this is going to be our main vocab word today, but we're also thinking about these other two, something called ridge push and slab pull. And while you didn't encounter those in your reading yet, you were hearing the description of them, just hasn't seen the name yet. So we're going to start getting into what those forces are. So when we think about convection, one thing that might come to mind is this guy right here, a lava lamp, right? In the lava lamp, we see material moving around because of a heat source, right? When you have the lava lamp unplugged, nothing's happening to it. But when you turn it on, this lamp starts to heat up what I'm going to call the goop or the lava, and it starts to rise and sink based on changes in temperature. And that's exactly what's happening here inside the Earth's mantle. The mantle gets heated up by the Earth's core, and that material starts to move around and cycle through all the way up to the cold crust or lithosphere. And hopefully you can see a little bit on here that as the inside of the Earth moves, the outside of the Earth moves right along with it, depending on the motion at that spot. So that's really what we want to start connecting today. How does the inside drive the outside, and what is the exact motion underneath to make our different types of boundaries appear on the surface? So again, on your sheet there, you have a few blanks to fill in about the definition of convection. And it's the definition explaining the flow of material based on changes in temperature and density. So in a convection current, we see hot mantle material rising upward and cool mantle material sinking down due to its change in density. And that whole process of warm rising, cool sinking, changes in temperature and density is the idea of this convection. So you have this diagram here where we want to draw in just a simple convection current in this really thick layer of the mantle. Now the mantle is where convection happens because of the heat from the outer core and the plastic-like texture of this upper mantle, which remember is that asthenosphere. Oh no. So what we have going on is we want to label a diagram showing that warm rising material and cool sinking material. So our color is pretty important. So we've got warm rising from the core up to the surface. It hits the underneath side of the crust, shifts along the bottom of it, and now it's been away from the heat of the core for a little bit, and so it starts to cool, increasing its density, causing it to sink back down. It now comes in contact with the core over time, reheats, and continues cycling through again due to changes in temperature and density. So you should have drawn in here a simple convection current, warm rising labeled as red, cool sinking labeled with blue. Now it's not just one giant convection, but it's many different convection currents happening inside the Earth. So we can see a nice visual of that here. We've got 1, 2, 3, 4 convection currents in our view here. And where the convection currents interact is what is creating our plate boundaries. So here's boundary number 1, boundary 2, and boundary 3. So we want to observe, again, what's happening down here in the asthenosphere to create the movement up top. So I'm looking at this convection interaction, and I'm seeing the arrows starting to look like they're moving apart, right? These convection currents are cycling away from each other. So this type of boundary right here on the Earth's surface is going to do the same thing. That's a divergent plate boundary. Here for boundary number 2, I'm looking at the interaction of these two convection currents. Again, just looking at the motion of those arrows, I can see they're merging together, sinking back down. This boundary number 2 would then be a convergent boundary. And the final one, number 3, the blue diagram. Again, looking at the interaction of convection, I see it coming upwards here and separating. Boundary number 3 is another divergent plate boundary. So the idea here is whatever happens on the inside drives the movement of the crust on the surface or the outside. So what we're looking at is not only the whole process of convection, but also focusing in on these individual movements and giving them a name. So that's what we're looking at here with our diagram. So we've got our boundaries already filled in, convergent and divergent. We're going to start right here. We're going to put in the name and a description of the force happening at the divergent boundary. So essentially what the convection is doing at that spot. So the name for the divergent boundary is known as ridge push. Ridge push is describing the motion of the mantle material at a divergent boundary. So you might want to pause so you can get this little section typed in or written in your spot right here. So you should already have ridge push filled in. Now you're writing your description. Ridge push is describing the force created from the rising mantle material inside the crust, reaching the underneath and separating itself, creating that divergent boundary on the surface. So the second part of your table should have a diagram like this one where we want to draw in the exact convection creating this force and this boundary. So again, ridge push is being described as rising mantle material. So right at the boundary line, which is here where the two plates meet, we want to draw in our warm, rising mantle material. And we're just illustrating this as it reaches the underside of the crust, separates out. Make sure you're color coding using red for that warm rising. Gets far from the crust, cools, and sinks back down. So this idea of ridge push is happening here, describing the force associated with warm rising material coming up and separating down. You've got one more part of your table there. It's asking about the motion. So you could fill in any word or visual describing how divergent plates move relative to each other. Our second force for convergent boundary is known as slab pull. So we're on the left side of the chart now, putting in the name and the description of the force creating a convergent boundary. It's created from sinking cooled mantle material in the convection current. And because that material is sinking downward, gravity is also helping it move in that direction over time. So again, we want to draw in on our diagram where exactly the currents are to create this type of boundary. So here is our boundary, spot where the two plates meet. We know the pieces of crust in a convergent boundary are coming together, so I need to make sure my convection is doing just that. And because it's sinking and cool, I'm using the blue color. And I'm just going to trace right along this sinking piece of crust. So this arrow is illustrating the motion of the left side. I need another cool sinking arrow to illustrate the motion of the right side. So when I look at the motion inside the earth, it's the same as what's happening on the surface. And that's driven, of course, by the warm rising happening on the other side. And if you look carefully, you'll even see on your picture, there's a divergent boundary right here. So we've even got that already going with our sheet. So the last part is you've got a word or a diagram labeling in motion for convergent boundary. So describing how these plates are moving relative to each other. Okay, so your diagrams look like this. Again, color-coded based on warm rising or cool sinking. So each part of the convection is showing the motion happening on the surface. Got ridge push, rising and separating, slab pull, cooling, coming together, and sinking down. So we also want to label up here some features associated with these boundaries. Earthquakes, of course, being created as the earth moves in 3 possible depths. You might remember when we saw convergent boundary maps earlier in this unit, we noticed that earthquakes were happening in every single depth at this boundary. And the reason is because look at what's happening here. This crust is being pulled into the earth. So by being pulled into the earth, that's anywhere the earth moves, therefore an earthquake can happen at any spot. So while you throw those in there, make sure you're just giving them a quick color code so it matches the key I gave you in your table. Shallow being red, green being medium, and blue being deep. Now as far as volcanoes goes, we have to have some sort of molten rock. And because this material is being pulled into the earth and superheated, it's also melting, creating volcanoes right on the surface above that spot. So we have a few volcanoes adding in right on the bump that you see there on your diagram. And when we look at the location of each of these, we see the volcanoes are happening off the boundary, while the earthquakes are happening on and off the boundary. Some are right where the 2 plates meet, and others are further away. Divergent boundary, same kind of thing. We're looking at where the 2 plates meet. Again, in terms of earthquakes, just means the earth is moving, and so the spot where those 2 plates interact is the spot where they move the most. And because there's no subduction or plate being pulled underneath here, we're going to see all of our earthquakes happening on the boundary at a shallow depth. Now, because volcanoes happen with molten rock, we do occasionally have some magma ooze its way through the literal crack found at the divergent boundary. And so again, it's possible to have volcanoes right on the boundary line. So your line is getting kind of crowded here with divergent. You're seeing volcanoes on and shallow earthquakes right on the boundary. So the last thing here is you have this diagram and you're working to figure out where exactly the convection currents are here underneath the earth. So look closely and find divergent and convergent boundaries on the surface, and then draw in your warm rising arrows to match and your cool sinking arrows to match, putting convection in the right location. This is also really going to help you out with learning target 3. So you should be able to complete that while you're finishing up your diagram. As always, reach out with questions. Talk to you soon.